Hello my dear chess friends and welcome to today's lesson. This is International Master Camelia Ciobanu, and in this video we will see from one of Lasker's games how to play with the double pawns and how to play against them. So this is a unique combination, and this game has been played in the year of 1897 in St. Petersburg, and Mikhail Chigorin was having the white pieces against the second world champion Emanuel Lasker. They played a very nice opening, the Evans Gambit. So let's see it. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and finally white sacrifices the pawn on b4. Okay, let's see if this will really give white a compensation of the initiative in order to be able to develop his pieces much faster than black does. Okay, so bishop to c5 and white castles before black does. Pawn to d6 to open up the light squared bishop. And finally, white occupies the center with the second pawn, again threatening for the third time the dark squared bishop. Well, black does not accept the trade on d4, but instead he retreats the bishop because he wants to remain with the pawn in the center. Okay, white is going after that bishop fiercely, and so black will take on d4 right now, so that white remains with a weak pawn in the center, and that becomes black's target because now he is pinning the knight that is defending the d4 pawn. How can white defend the pawn? He will pin one of the attackers, which is the knight on c6, and so black decides to gain the pair of bishops. Now black remains with double pawns on the c file, which is a semi-open file, and the pawn on a6 remains without protection, so it is a weak pawn itself. Good, so let's see how it continues. White just expands a little bit more on the queen side by pushing the pawn and gaining more space. The bishop has to retreat, and now bishop to e3 defending the pawn. Well, black will continue to develop even the knight on e7 in order to be able to castle. And finally white goes away from the pin, and this gives black opportunity to create doubled pawns on the f5 for white. So not only black has double pawns, but his opponent does too. Okay, so what is black going to do? Can you see that the pawns are weaker if they are exposed on a semi-open file? And since white has gained so much space on the queen side, black should focus on the king side instead, and that's where he would develop his attack. Therefore, he pushes the pawn to f5, even threatening to go forward on f4. You see, he's gaining more space on the king side, and in the same time, white would be losing the pawn on d4. So white is blocking the pawn, and now black has the possibility to trade on e4, and thus leaving white with the double pawns on the semi-open file. So what black accomplished with this trade is that he managed to open the rook so that it can attack white's weak pawns. Not only that, but now black has a good bishop, and white has a bad bishop that is of the same color of all the disposition of its pawns. Okay, so basically white's bishop assumes a very, very passive role, maybe for the the whole game from now on. Okay, so black is pointing with his queen toward the king side again. The knight will cover the king, and also a prophylactic move is needed to take the king away from the light diagonal. Can you see that white doubles on the c file to increase the pressure on the weak pawn on c6? It's time for black to continue developing by bringing the rook on the open file, and from b8 the rook jumps on b5, attacking white's weak pawn on a5. Now the queen will go to defend it, but this invites black to enter the center with his knight, even attacking the queen. queen to d2 to preserve the pawn on a5. And now finally, black does not want to have the double pawns anymore, and he found the right moment to get rid of them by pushing the pawn to c5 and proposing a trade with the pawn on d4. White will take once, and now it's important to take the knight on e3 because the knight was hanging. Queen takes e3, and of course the pawn on c5 is pinned, but also the pawn on d6. So now black has to move the queen away from the pin. If black took on c5, can you see that he would simply lose the bishop after all this variation? Okay, white remains with the knight up. Good, so let's go back. And now the queen goes to f7, even attacking on f4 once more. Pawn f5, of course white could not have pushed the pawn, not taken on d6 because of the pin, as I said. And finally black can take back, and his bishop being very active, attacking not only the queen but also the weak pawn on f2, plus black has to pass the pawns, and so his position is clearly much better. Okay, queen to e6, and now it's time for some tactics. Bishop on f2, of course the king cannot take because white loses the queen because of the pin. We see many pins as we saw in Einstein's game, and I have just found out that Einstein was a very good friend of Emanuel Lasker, so they are using the same tactics. Good, so bishop takes f2, king to h1, and finally it's time to trade everything because black is 2 pawns up actually. Now the third pawn is falling. And again a prophylactic move to make a window for the king to escape. And finally black trades one rook, defending the pawn on c7 and then simply bringing the king up into play. It's very important to bring the rook behind the pawn that is threatening to promote. And finally to take away the possibility of white's king to approach the center any further. And finally, now white will have to give up the pawn on a7, trying a counterplay on the king's side by creating a passed pawn on the g5. It's just that black will reach right in time to promote his pawn. So can you see? The pawn is going forward and the king will come to its aid, even leaving the d pawn open to go forward, and it will just come with a check. We will see d4 g7. White is ready to promote, but here comes black promoting with a check, check, and in this position white resigns. Okay, at move number 57 after rook to f6. What happens if the king goes there? It's gonna be checkmate in 1. If the king goes to g2, there's gonna be check and checkmate. Or if king goes to h3, even rook h6 is sufficient to win, gaining everything, not leaving white with any piece but the king. Okay, my dear friends, so this is the game I wanted to show you. I thank you so much for your attention. I hope that you enjoyed today's lesson. If you would like to have a private lesson with me, please visit my coach profile so you can read my other students' feedback. And if you ever had a lesson, I invite you to write a review yourself in there. Thank you again for your attention, and I will talk to you during our next lesson. All the best!